Imagine stepping off a plane and feeling the warm Caribbean air hit your face. The smell of salt, tobacco, and something sweet, maybe sugarcane, maybe rum, wraps around you before you've even left the tarmac. You look up and the sky above is deep navy blue, scattered with stars. And somewhere in the distance, you can already hear music. This is Havana, and the night is just getting started. Before the Cuban Revolution of 1959, this city was something truly extraordinary. It was glamorous, electric, dangerous in the most exciting way, and absolutely alive after dark. The Cuban capital wasn't just a city, it was an experience, a destination, a myth that people crossed oceans, or in many cases just the Florida Strait, to witness for themselves. Now, let's put this in context. We're talking about the 1930s, 40s, and especially the 1950s. The world had just come out of a devastating war. America was booming. The middle class was growing. People had money to spend and a hunger for escape. And Havana was the escape. Just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Less than an hour by plane from Miami. Close enough to feel like a weekend trip. Exotic enough to feel like another world entirely. So what made Havana so irresistible? Well, start with the geography. The city sits on the northwestern coast of Cuba, wrapped around a natural bay, one of the finest natural harbors in the Western Hemisphere. Its colonial architecture, built by the Spanish over centuries, gave the streets a grandeur that felt almost European. Wide boulevards, ornate facades, balconies draped with bougainvillea, and weaving through all of it, the energy of a city that never, ever slept. The Malecon, Havana's famous seafront promenade, stretched for miles along the coast. During the day, fishermen cast their lines there, families walked, old men played dominoes. But at night, the Malecon transformed. Couples leaned against the seawall listening to the waves. Young men drove their sleek American cars slowly along the road, radios blasting. Street vendors sold food and cigarettes, and in the background, always in the background, music. By the 1950s, Havana had earned a reputation that few cities in the world could match. It was being called, quite seriously, the Las Vegas of the Caribbean. And that wasn't just marketing, that was reality. Think about what that phrase actually meant. Las Vegas in the American imagination was synonymous with freedom. Freedom from social rules, from routines, from responsibility. You could drink all night, you could gamble. You could see a show that would leave you speechless. You could be anyone you wanted to be. Havana offered all of that, and added something Las Vegas never quite had. Culture, history, music that didn't just entertain you, it moved through you. Food that was rich and layered. People who were warm, witty, and proud. Havana wasn't just a playground. It had a soul. The numbers speak for themselves. In the decade of the 1950s, Cuba was receiving close to 300,000 American tourists per year. That's an enormous figure for the era. And the majority of those visitors weren't coming for the beaches alone. They were coming for the nights. Havana had hundreds, and that's not an exaggeration. Hundreds of bars, cabarets, clubs, and dance halls operating simultaneously. From the most luxurious hotel lounges to small neighborhood spots where locals gathered, the city offered nightlife at every level. You could spend a fortune at a rooftop casino, or you could spend almost nothing sitting on a wooden stool at a corner bar, nursing a glass of rum while a trio played in the corner. And here's something that makes this story even more fascinating. The Cuban government at the time, under President Fulgencio Batista, a figure we'll return to throughout this documentary, actively encouraged and enabled this explosion of nightlife. Batista's administration in the 1950s had a deliberate policy of attracting foreign investment and tourism. Regulations were loosened, licenses were issued generously, and outside money, particularly from the United States, began pouring into Havana like never before. The result was rapid, dramatic transformation. Hotels rose, casinos opened, The city's skyline changed almost year by year. The Vedado neighborhood, once relatively quiet and residential, became a hub of modern hotels and entertainment venues. Havana was reinventing itself in real time, and the world was watching. But let's not reduce this story to economics and politics, because what made Havana's nightlife truly unforgettable, what made people come back, write about it, dream about it for decades afterward, was something harder to quantify. It was the feeling of the place, the way the heat of the evening loosened everything up, the way the music pulled you out of your chair, the way a stranger at the next table might become your dance partner by midnight and your friend by dawn. Havana before the revolution was a city where the night felt infinite, where the rules of ordinary life were temporarily suspended, where rich Americans and Cuban workers and jazz musicians and diplomats and gamblers and writers all found themselves somehow in the same rooms, under the same stars, moved by the same rhythms. It was a world unlike any other. And in the chapters ahead, we're going to walk straight into it. Welcome to the casinos of pre-revolutionary Havana. To understand how extraordinary these places were, you need to understand what gambling meant in the 1950s. In the United States, casino gambling was largely illegal outside of Nevada. The idea of walking into a world-class casino, dressed in your finest clothes, and sitting down at a blackjack table, that was something most Americans could only dream about. Unless, of course, they got on a plane to Havana. Cuba had legalized casino gambling, and the Batista government had made it abundantly clear that the right investors would be welcomed with open arms. What followed was one of the most remarkable and morally complicated building booms in Caribbean history. Let's start with the crown jewel, the Hotel Nacional de Cuba. Built in 1930 on a dramatic bluff overlooking the Malecon, the Hotel Nacional was, and still is, one of the most iconic buildings in Havana. Its twin towers rise above the rooftops of the Vedado neighborhood, visible from the sea. The architecture blends Spanish colonial and Art Deco styles with sweeping gardens, terracotta rooftops, and wide verandas that look out over the Straits of Florida. In its golden era, the National was the place to stay, not just in Havana, in the entire hemisphere. The guest list reads like a who's who of the 20th century: Winston Churchill, Marlene Dietrich, Ava Gardner, Frank Sinatra, Ernest Hemingway. These weren't occasional visitors. They were regulars, people who came back year after year because there was simply nowhere else quite like it. The casino inside the Nacional hummed with a particular kind of energy. It was elegant but charged, refined but thrilling. Men in linen suits and women in evening gowns moved between roulette wheels and card tables. The air smelled of expensive perfume and cigarette smoke. Cocktails arrived on silver trays. And underneath all that polish, there was the constant, irresistible tension of money-changing hands. But the National was just the beginning. In 1955, a new hotel opened just down the road and immediately raised the stakes: the Hotel Riviera. Designed by American architects, built at a cost of over $14 million, the Riviera was the most modern hotel in Latin America when it opened. Its sleek mid-century design was a statement. This wasn't colonial Cuba anymore. This was international, cosmopolitan, ultra-modern Havana. The Riviera had a rooftop pool, a Copa Room showroom that seated hundreds, and a casino that could hold its own against anything in Nevada. Then there was the Hotel Capri, which opened the same year. Smaller but stylish, the Capri attracted a younger, hipper crowd. Its rooftop pool became legendary. Its casino was intimate and electric. And of course, no conversation about Havana's casino era is complete without addressing the elephant in the room. Because behind many of these glamorous establishments, financing them, running them, profiting from them, were figures connected to organized crime in the United States. The most significant of these was Meyer Lansky. Lansky was one of the most powerful organized crime figures in American history, a financial genius who helped build the infrastructure of the mob's gambling operations. And in the 1950s, he set his sights on Havana. With Batista's blessing, and reportedly with direct financial arrangements between Lansky and the Cuban president, the American mobster became the de facto architect of Havana's casino industry. Lansky didn't just invest money, he brought expertise. He imported experienced casino managers, dealers, and security personnel from Las Vegas and Miami. He standardized operations, improved the odds to attract serious gamblers, and cracked down on the kind of petty cheating that had given Cuban casinos a somewhat shady reputation in earlier decades. Under Lansky's influence, Havana's casinos became genuinely world-class operations, honest by the standards of the gambling world, professionally run, and enormously profitable. It's a deeply uncomfortable story in many ways. The glamour of those casino floors was real, but so was the corruption that made it possible. Batista's government was receiving payments. Officials looked the other way. The line between legitimate business and criminal enterprise was, in Havana's casino world, essentially invisible. And yet, and this is what makes history so endlessly complicated, for the tens of thousands of people who worked in those hotels and casinos, this was simply their livelihood. Bartenders, dealers, musicians, waitstaff, cooks, cleaners. Real people with families and rent to pay, whose daily lives were bound up in this glittering, morally ambiguous machine. The experience for a tourist arriving at one of these establishments was designed to be seamless and intoxicating from the very first moment. A porter would take your bags. A smiling receptionist would check you in. Your room, perhaps overlooking the pool or the sea or the illuminated Havana skyline, would be impeccably prepared. And then, as the evening came, you would drift downstairs, drawn by the sound of music and laughter, and step into a world that felt designed specifically to make you feel like the luckiest person alive. At the roulette wheel, a croupier in a white jacket would spin the wheel with practiced elegance. At the blackjack tables, the cards moved so smoothly it almost looked choreographed. Baccarat, the game of choice for high rollers, was played in slightly more private rooms, away from the general floor, with higher minimum bets and a more exclusive atmosphere. And through it all, the drinks kept coming. Cuba Libre, daiquiri, mojito, rum on the rocks. The bars inside these casino hotels were staffed by some of the best mixologists in the Caribbean, and the rum, always the rum, was exceptional. By the late 1950s, Havana's casino industry was generating millions of dollars per year. The city had become genuinely addictive, for tourists, for investors, for the Cuban government, and for the criminal networks that had woven themselves into its foundations. It was a world built on spectacle, money, and carefully maintained illusions. And like all such worlds, it could not last forever. You've checked into your hotel. You've tried your luck at the casino. Your glass has been refilled twice. And now someone at the next table leans over and says, with the knowing smile of a person who has been to Havana before, "You haven't seen anything yet. Tonight, we're going to Tropicana." And just like that, the night shifts into something else entirely. If the casinos represented Havana's appetite for money and glamour, the cabarets represented something deeper, something that couldn't be imported from Las Vegas or manufactured by mob investors. The cabarets of Havana were the beating cultural heart of the city's nightlife, places where Cuban artistry, African rhythm, Spanish melody, and pure theatrical spectacle collided in ways that left audiences genuinely breathless. And at the center of it all stood one name, one place, one legend above all others: the Tropicana. Founded in 1939 in the lush Marianao neighborhood on the outskirts of Havana, the Tropicana Club was, and this is not hyperbole, one of the most extraordinary entertainment venues ever created. Its official nickname was Paradise Under the Stars, and if you stood in that open-air theater on a warm Havana night, surrounded by tropical trees hung with lights, with a full orchestra playing and dozens of dancers moving across a stage that seemed to dissolve into the garden itself, you would understand immediately why that name stuck. The concept behind Tropicana was visionary from the start. Its founder, Victor de Correa, and later its most famous manager, Martin Fox, understood something that many entertainment entrepreneurs miss entirely, that the setting is part of the show. The Tropicana wasn't just a venue with a stage. The entire property was the stage. The trees were set pieces. The night sky was the ceiling. The warm air was part of the atmosphere in the most literal sense. The main performance space, known as the Arcos de Cristal, the Crystal Arches, was a masterpiece of mid-century architecture. Designed by Cuban architect Max Borges Recio, it featured sweeping arched glass walls that opened the interior to the surrounding gardens. Natural light by day, theatrical lighting by night. It was the kind of space that made you feel, the moment you entered, that something remarkable was about to happen. And it always was. The shows at Tropicana were unlike anything being produced anywhere else in the world. They combined elements that had no business working together, and somehow, in this context, worked perfectly. Afro-Cuban religious dance traditions, with their deep roots in the Yoruba culture brought to Cuba by enslaved Africans, were incorporated into choreography that was simultaneously reverent and electrifying. Classical ballet technique met street rumba. Orchestras of 20, 30, 40 musicians played arrangements that moved without warning, from lush romantic ballads into explosive percussion-driven mambo. The costumes deserve their own chapter. Elaborate headdresses that towered feet above the dancers' heads, adorned with feathers, fruit, flowers, and glittering stones. Gowns in electric colors, turquoise, gold, scarlet, that caught the light as the dancers moved. The visual spectacle was overwhelming in the best possible way, and it was all designed in-house by Cuban artisans and seamstresses who worked year-round preparing for each new production. On a peak night, Tropicana might have 200 performers on that stage simultaneously, dancers, singers, acrobats, musicians. The scale was operatic. The energy was something closer to a religious experience than a night out. And the audiences, they came from everywhere. American tourists who had heard about Tropicana in magazines back home and had built their entire trip around a single night there. European visitors who arrived in Havana already knowing that this was the one thing they could not miss. Cuban socialites and businessmen who came regularly and still found themselves moved by shows they had seen a dozen times. And celebrities, always celebrities, whose presence in the audience became part of the event itself. Nat King Cole performed at Tropicana. So did Edith Piaf. So did countless Cuban artists whose names were known across the Americas and beyond. Being invited to perform at Tropicana wasn't just a booking. It was a statement. It meant you had arrived. But Tropicana, magnificent as it was, wasn't the only cabaret shaping Havana's nights. The Sans Souci was another legendary venue. A sprawling open-air club that combined a casino with spectacular floor shows and attracted a slightly wilder, more unpredictable crowd than Tropicana's polished elegance. The Sans Souci had its own personality, its own loyal following, its own brand of Cuban magic. Then, there were the smaller clubs scattered across Havana's neighborhoods, venues that didn't have the budget for 200 performers or elaborate costumes, but had something equally valuable: intimacy. Places where you sat close enough to the musicians to see the sweat on their foreheads and the concentration in their eyes. Where a singer might lean forward mid-song and direct a line of a bolero straight at someone in the front row, and the whole room would hold its breath. This brings us to the music itself, because you cannot tell the story of Havana's nightlife without spending serious time with the soundtrack. The 1940s and 50s were a golden age for Cuban music, arguably the most creatively explosive period in the island's musical history. Son cubano, the foundational genre born in the eastern provinces, had by this point traveled to Havana and been transformed by the city's energy into something faster, more complex, more urban. Mambo, a word that even today carries a charge of pure excitement, was born out of Cuban jazz orchestras pushing against the limits of traditional rhythm. Cha-cha-cha arrived in the early 1950s and swept dance floors across the hemisphere. Bolero filled the small hours with romantic melancholy and longing, and the musicians performing this music in Havana's clubs and cabarets were, by any measure, world-class artists. Benny Moré, known simply as El Bárbaro del Ritmo, the barbarian of rhythm, was a vocalist and bandleader of almost supernatural ability, capable of moving between genres with effortless mastery and commanding a room with nothing more than his voice. Damaso Pérez Prado, the self-proclaimed king of mambo, brought a theatrical energy to his performances that matched anything happening on Tropicana's stage. And Celia Cruz, still in the early years of a career that would eventually make her one of the most famous Cuban artists in history, was already electrifying audiences with a voice that seemed too big for any room she performed in. To be in Havana during these years, and to move through its cabarets and clubs, was to be present at one of the great cultural moments of the 20th century. You were hearing music being invented in real time, watching art forms evolve in front of your eyes, being part of an audience that would later tell their grandchildren, "I was there." The lights, the costumes, the rhythms, the heat, all of it woven together into something that felt, to everyone who experienced it, utterly irreplaceable. They were right. It was. Every great night eventually reaches its final hour. The moment when the lights begin to soften, the music slows, and the magic that felt so permanent just hours ago reveals itself for what it always was. Something fragile, something borrowed, something built on foundations that not everyone could see clearly in the dark. Havana in the 1950s was that night. Brilliant, intoxicating, unforgettable. And quietly, beneath all that brilliance, already counting down. But before we get to the end, let's spend some time in the places where the night truly began. Because no evening in Havana, not for a tourist, not for a writer, not for a local, started without first stopping at a bar. And Havana's bars were, in their own way, just as legendary as its casinos and cabarets. The most famous of them all was El Floridita. Located on the corner of Obispo and Monserrate in Old Havana, El Floridita had been operating since 1817, making it one of the oldest bars in Cuba. By the 1950s, it had earned the nickname the Cradle of the Daiquiri, a title it wore with complete justification. The bar's head bartender, a man named Constantino Ribelegua Vert, known affectionately as Constante, had spent decades perfecting the frozen daiquiri into a drink of almost architectural precision. Cold, sharp, balanced, a combination of white rum, lime juice and sugar that somehow tasted like Havana itself distilled into a glass. El Floridita had a particular glow to it at night. The mahogany bar ran the full length of the room. Stools were almost always occupied. The bartenders moved with the quiet confidence of craftsmen who knew exactly what they were doing. And presiding over a corner stool, more nights than not, was a broad-shouldered American with a white beard and an expression that suggested he had seen everything worth seeing and was perfectly content to sit here and drink until he saw something more interesting. Ernest Hemingway had discovered El Floridita in the 1930s and never really left. He became so associated with the place that a bronze statue of him was eventually installed at his preferred spot at the bar, a permanent resident, even after he was gone. Hemingway's presence at El Floridita brought other writers, journalists, and intellectuals into its orbit, turning the bar into something of an informal salon where conversation moved between literature, politics, fishing, and the quality of the current batch of rum. A few blocks away, down the narrow cobblestone streets of Old Havana, stood La Bodeguita del Medio. Where El Floridita was polished and cosmopolitan, La Bodeguita was something rawer and more intimate. Its walls were covered floor to ceiling in signatures, drawings, and messages left by visitors over the decades, a physical record of everyone who had passed through. The drink of choice here was the mojito, rum, lime, sugar, mint, and soda water, served in tall glasses that sweated in the warm air. Hemingway supposedly summed up his Havana drinking philosophy in a phrase that became famous: "My mojito in la bodeguita, my daiquiri in el floridita." Whether he actually said it is disputed by historians. But the fact that people believed it, and still believe it, tells you everything about the mythology these two places had accumulated. This culture of rum was not incidental to Havana's nightlife, it was foundational. Cuba had been producing sugarcane since the 16th century, and rum, distilled from sugarcane molasses, was as Cuban as the music, as the tobacco, as the warm sea air. Brands like Bacardi, founded in Santiago de Cuba in 1862, and Havana Club had made Cuban rum internationally recognized. When you drank a daiquiri at El Floridita or a mojito at La Bodeguita, you were participating in something with centuries of history behind it, and the Americans understood this. They came in enormous numbers, drawn by the proximity, the freedom, the exchange rate that made everything feel affordable, and the particular intoxication of being somewhere that operated by different rules. An estimated 300,000 American tourists were visiting Cuba annually by the mid-1950s. They filled the hotels, the casinos, the cabarets, and the bars. They drove the economy of Havana's tourist districts into a state of almost permanent celebration. But here is where the story demands that we stop, that we pull back from the candle-lit bars and the casino floors and the spectacular Tropicana stage, that we look at the wider frame. Because Havana was not one city, it was two. The Havana that tourists experienced, and that we have been describing throughout this documentary, was real. The glamour was genuine, the music was extraordinary, the rum was excellent. But this Havana occupied a relatively small portion of the city's actual geography, and an even smaller portion of its social reality. Beyond the Vedado Hotel Strip, beyond old Havana's famous bars, beyond the illuminated facade of the Tropicana, lived the other Havana. The Havana of crowded tenements in neighborhoods like Centro Habana and Jesus Maria, where families shared single rooms and running water was not guaranteed. The Havana of rural migrants who had come to the capital looking for work and found themselves trapped in poverty with no path upward. The Havana of Afro-Cuban communities who provided much of the cultural vitality that made the city's nightlife so extraordinary. The dancers, the musicians, the cooks, but who were systematically excluded from its economic rewards and often from its most prestigious venues as well. The racial dimension of this story is impossible to ignore and deeply painful. The same Afro-Cuban traditions that gave Tropicana's shows their most electric moments, the Yoruba-derived rhythms, the spiritual dances, the percussion at the core of Cuban music, were drawn from communities that faced significant discrimination in the very city that was profiting from their cultural inheritance. Some of Havana's most exclusive establishments had informal, but firmly enforced policies that restricted black Cubans from entering as guests, even as they performed on stage or worked in the kitchens. The economic inequality was staggering even by the standards of the era. Cuba, in the 1950s, had one of the highest per capita incomes in Latin America, on paper. But that wealth was concentrated with extraordinary sharpness. A small elite connected to either the Batista government or to American business interests accumulated enormous fortunes. The rural population, particularly in the eastern provinces far from Havana's glow, lived in conditions of grinding poverty. Illiteracy rates in the countryside were devastating. Access to healthcare was minimal for those outside the cities. Batista's government was not merely tolerant of this inequality. It was its architect and its enforcer. Political opposition was suppressed. Journalists who wrote critically of the regime faced consequences. And the revenue generated by the casino industry, so much of which flowed through arrangements that benefited Batista personally and his circle directly, was not being reinvested in the Cuban people. Fidel Castro and the revolutionary movement he was building through the 1950s understood all of this with crystalline clarity. The anger that fed the revolution was not manufactured or imported. It grew organically from the lived experience of millions of Cubans who watched the lights of the Tropicana from a distance and understood with a bitterness that no amount of rum could soften, that those lights were not for them. On January 1st, 1959, Batista fled Cuba. The casinos closed. The American tourists stopped coming. Meyer Lansky lost everything he had built. The Hotel Riviera, the Capri, the Nacional, they remained standing, but the world that had filled them evaporated almost overnight. El Floridita still stands today on that same corner in old Havana. Hemingway's bronze statue still occupies his corner stool. La Bodeguita del Medio still has walls covered in signatures. The Tropicana, remarkably, still operates, one of the only surviving institutions from that era, still presenting shows under the stars in those same gardens. But the Havana that existed before the revolution, that particular collision of luxury and music and corruption and creativity and inequality and joy, belongs entirely to the past now. It exists in photographs, in film reels, in the memories of those who were there, and in the strange, melancholy beauty of a city that still carries the ghost of what it once was. Was it a golden age? That depends entirely on who you were and where you stood when the lights were on. For some, it was paradise. For others, it was a paradise they were never allowed to enter. That tension, between the spectacle and the suffering, between the music and the silence underneath it, is the true story of Havana's nights before the revolution. And it is a story worth remembering in all its complexity, in all its beauty, and in all its injustice. The music played on until the night it didn't.